the new god of Mammon, the new gods of Mammon, the new god of Mammon, the new goddess of Mammon, the new goddesses of Mammon, the new goddess of Mammon, the old god of Mammon, the old gods of Mammon, the old god of Mammon, the old goddess of Mammon, the old goddesses of Mammon, the old goddess of Mammon, the greater god of Mammon, the greater gods of Mammon, the greater god of Mammon, the greater goddess of Mammon, the greater goddesses of Mammon, the greater goddess of Mammon, the lesser god of Mammon, the lesser gods of Mammon, the lesser god of Mammon, the lesser goddess of Mammon, the lesser goddesses of Mammon, the lesser goddess of Mammon, the higher god of Mammon, the higher gods of Mammon, the higher god of Mammon, the higher goddess of Mammon, the higher goddesses of Mammon, the higher goddess of Mammon, the lower god of Mammon, the lower gods of Mammon, the lower god of Mammon, the lower goddess of Mammon, the lower goddesses of Mammon, the lower goddess of Mammon, the greater spirit of Mammon, the greater spirits of Mammon, the greater spirit of Mammon, the lesser spirit of Mammon, the lesser spirits of Mammon, the lesser spirit of Mammon, the higher spirit of Mammon, the higher spirits of Mammon, the higher spirit of Mammon, the lower spirit of Mammon, the lower spirits of Mammon, the lower spirit of Mammon, the major god of Mammon, the major gods of Mammon, the major god of Mammon, the major goddess of Mammon, the major goddesses of Mammon, the major goddess of Mammon, the minor god of Mammon, the minor gods of Mammon, the minor god of Mammon, the minor goddess of Mammon, the minor goddesses of Mammon, the minor goddess of Mammon, the superior god of Mammon, the superior gods of Mammon, the superior god of Mammon, the superior goddess of Mammon, the superior goddesses of Mammon, the superior goddess of Mammon, the inferior god of Mammon, the inferior gods of Mammon, the inferior god of Mammon, the inferior goddess of Mammon, the inferior goddesses of Mammon, the inferior goddess of Mammon, the ancestor god of Mammon, the ancestor gods of Mammon, the ancestor god of Mammon, the ancestor goddess of Mammon, the ancestor goddesses of Mammon, the ancestor goddess of Mammon, the ascendant god of Mammon, the ascendant gods of Mammon, the ascendant god of Mammon, the ascendant goddess of Mammon, the ascendant goddesses of Mammon, the ascendant goddess of Mammon, the descendant god of Mammon, the descendant gods of Mammon, the descendant god of Mammon, the descendant goddess of Mammon, the descendant goddesses of Mammon, the descendant goddess of Mammon, the transcendent god of Mammon, the transcendent gods of Mammon, the transcendent god of Mammon, the transcendent goddess of Mammon, the transcendent goddesses of Mammon, the transcendent goddess of Mammon, the past god of Mammon, the past gods of Mammon, the past god of Mammon, the past goddess of Mammon, the past goddesses of Mammon, the past goddess of Mammon, the present god of Mammon, the present gods of Mammon, the present god of Mammon, the present goddess of Mammon, the present goddesses of Mammon, the present goddess of Mammon, the future god of Mammon, the future gods of Mammon, the future god of Mammon, the future goddess of Mammon, the future goddesses of Mammon, the future goddess of Mammon, the authentic god of Mammon, the authentic gods of Mammon, the authentic god of Mammon, the authentic goddess of Mammon, the authentic goddesses of Mammon, the authentic goddess of Mammon, the synthetic god of Mammon, the synthetic gods of Mammon, the synthetic god of Mammon, the synthetic goddess of Mammon, the synthetic goddesses of Mammon, the synthetic goddess of Mammon, the progressive god of Mammon, the progressive gods of Mammon, the progressive god of Mammon, the progressive goddess of Mammon, the progressive goddesses of Mammon, the progressive goddess of Mammon, the regressive god of Mammon, the regressive gods of Mammon, the regressive god of Mammon, the regressive goddess of Mammon, the regressive goddesses of Mammon, the regressive goddess of Mammon, the ordinary god of Mammon, the ordinary gods of Mammon, the ordinary god of Mammon, the ordinary goddess of Mammon, the ordinary goddesses of Mammon, the ordinary goddess of Mammon, the extraordinary god of Mammon, the extraordinary gods of Mammon, the extraordinary god of Mammon, the extraordinary goddess of Mammon, the extraordinary goddesses of Mammon, the extraordinary goddess of Mammon, the static god of Mammon, the static gods of Mammon, the static god of Mammon, the static goddess of Mammon, the static goddesses of Mammon, the static goddess of Mammon, the dynamic god of Mammon, the dynamic gods of Mammon, the dynamic god of Mammon, the dynamic goddess of Mammon, the dynamic goddesses of Mammon, the dynamic goddess of Mammon, the land god of Mammon, the land gods of Mammon, the land god of Mammon, the land goddess of Mammon, the land goddesses of Mammon, the land goddess of Mammon, the sea god of Mammon, the sea gods of Mammon, the sea god of Mammon, the sea goddess of Mammon, the sea goddesses of Mammon, the sea goddess of Mammon, the sky god of Mammon, the sky gods of Mammon, the sky god of Mammon, the sky goddess of Mammon, the sky goddesses of Mammon, the sky goddess of Mammon, the god of Mammon, the gods of Mammon, the god of Mammon, the goddess of Mammon, the goddesses of Mammon, the goddess of Mammon, the half god of Mammon, the half gods of Mammon, the half god of Mammon, the half goddess of Mammon, the half goddesses of Mammon, the half goddess of Mammon, the vessel of Mammon, the vessels of Mammon, the vessel of Mammon, the name of Mammon, the names of Mammon, the name of Mammon, the person of Mammon, the persons of Mammon, the person of Mammon, the persona of Mammon, the personas of Mammon, the persona of Mammon, the personage of Mammon, the personages of Mammon, the personage of Mammon, the personality of Mammon, the personalities of Mammon, the personality of Mammon, the personification of Mammon, the personifications of Mammon, the personification of Mammon, the image of Mammon, the images of Mammon, the image of Mammon, the imagination of Mammon, the imaginations of Mammon, the imagination of Mammon, the belief of Mammon, the beliefs of Mammon, the belief of Mammon, the thought of Mammon, the thoughts of Mammon, the thought of Mammon, the word of Mammon, the words of Mammon, the word of Mammon, the action of Mammon, the actions of Mammon, the action of Mammon, the reaction of Mammon, the reactions of Mammon, the reaction of Mammon, the feeling of Mammon, the feelings of Mammon, the feeling of Mammon, the situation of Mammon, the situations of Mammon, the situation of Mammon, the circumstance of Mammon, the circumstances of Mammon, the circumstance of Mammon, the environment of Mammon, the environments of Mammon, the environment of Mammon, the relationship of Mammon, the relationships of Mammon, the relationship of Mammon, the number of Mammon, the numbers of Mammon, the number of Mammon, the formula of Mammon, the formulas of Mammon, the formula of Mammon, the equation of Mammon, the equations of Mammon, the equation of Mammon, the theory of Mammon, the theories of Mammon, the theory of Mammon, the symbol of Mammon, the symbols of Mammon, the symbol of Mammon, the color of Mammon, the colors of Mammon, the color of Mammon, the thing of Mammon, the things of Mammon, the thing of Mammon, the way of Mammon, the ways of Mammon, the way of Mammon, the place of Mammon, the places of Mammon, the place of Mammon, the time of Mammon, the times of Mammon, the time of Mammon, the event of Mammon, the events of Mammon, the event of Mammon, the result of Mammon, the results of Mammon, the result of Mammon, the crown of Mammon, the crowns of Mammon, the crown of Mammon, the throne of Mammon, the thrones of Mammon, the throne of Mammon, the Mammon king, the Mammon kings, the Mammon kingdom, the Mammon kingdoms, the Mammon king's subject, the Mammon king's subjects, the Mammon king's dominion, the Mammon king's dominions, the kingdom of Mammon, the kingdoms of Mammon, the kingdom of Mammon, the Mammon queen, the Mammon queens, the Mammon queendom, the Mammon queendoms, the Mammon queen's subject, the Mammon queen's subjects, the Mammon queen's dominion, the Mammon queen's dominions, the queendom of Mammon, the queendoms of Mammon, the queendom of Mammon, the Mammon prince, the Mammon princes, the Mammon princedom, the Mammon princedoms, the Mammon prince's subject, the Mammon prince's subjects, the Mammon prince's dominion, the Mammon prince's dominions, the princedom of Mammon, the princedoms of Mammon, the princedom of Mammon, the Mammon princess, the Mammon princesses, the Mammon princessdom, the Mammon princessdoms, the Mammon princesses subject, the Mammon princesses subjects, the Mammon princesses dominion, the Mammon princesses dominions, the princessdom of Mammon, the princessdoms of Mammon, the princessdom of Mammon, the lord of Mammon, the lords of Mammon, the lord of Mammon, the lordess of Mammon, the lordesses of Mammon, the lordess of Mammon, the priest of Mammon, the priests of Mammon, the priest of Mammon, the priestess of Mammon, the priestesses of Mammon, the priestess of Mammon, the ritual of Mammon, the rituals of Mammon, the ritual of Mammon, the shrine of Mammon, the shrines of Mammon, the shrine of Mammon, the temple of Mammon, the temples of Mammon, the temple of Mammon, the leader of Mammon, the leaders of Mammon, the leader of Mammon, the follower of Mammon, the followers of Mammon, the follower of Mammon, the natural substance of Mammon, the natural substances of Mammon, the natural substance of Mammon, the supernatural substance of Mammon, the supernatural substances of Mammon, the supernatural substance of Mammon, the temporal substance of Mammon, the temporal substances of Mammon, the temporal substance of Mammon, the spiritual substance of Mammon, the spiritual substances of Mammon, the spiritual substance of Mammon, the natural form of Mammon, the natural forms of Mammon, the natural form of Mammon, the supernatural form of Mammon, the supernatural forms of Mammon, the supernatural form of Mammon, the temporal form of Mammon, the temporal forms of Mammon, the temporal form of Mammon, the spiritual form of Mammon, the spiritual forms of Mammon, the spiritual form of Mammon, the age of Mammon, the ages of Mammon, the age of Mammon, the era of Mammon, the heiress of Mammon, the era of Mammon, the awakener of Mammon, the awakeners of Mammon, the awakener of Mammon, the awakening of Mammon, the awakenings of Mammon, the awakening of Mammon, the realm of Mammon, the realms of Mammon, the realm of Mammon, the dimension of Mammon, the dimensions of Mammon, the dimension of Mammon, the zone of Mammon, the zones of Mammon, the zone of Mammon, the frequency of Mammon, the frequencies of Mammon, the frequency of Mammon, the century of Mammon, the centuries of Mammon, the century of Mammon, the millennium of Mammon, the millenniums of Mammon, the millennium of Mammon, the purpose of Mammon, the purposes of Mammon, the purpose of Mammon, the meaning of Mammon, the meanings of Mammon, the meaning of Mammon, the culture of Mammon, the cultures of Mammon, the culture of Mammon, the demonstrator of Mammon, the demonstrators of Mammon, the demonstrator of Mammon, the demonstration of Mammon, the demonstrations of Mammon, the demonstration of Mammon, the manifester of Mammon, the manifestors of Mammon, the manifester of Mammon, the manifestation of Mammon, the manifestations of Mammon, the manifestation of Mammon, the presence of Mammon, the presences of Mammon, the presence of Mammon, the glow of Mammon, the glows of Mammon, the glow of Mammon, the goal of Mammon, the goals of Mammon, the goal of Mammon, the plan of Mammon, the plans of Mammon, the plan of Mammon, the book of Mammon, the books of Mammon, the book of Mammon, the philosopher of Mammon, the philosophers of Mammon, the philosopher of Mammon, the philosophy of Mammon, the philosophies of Mammon, the philosophy of Mammon, the releaser of Mammon, the releasers of Mammon, the releaser of Mammon, the release of Mammon, the releases of Mammon, the release of Mammon, the variable of Mammon, the variables of Mammon, the variable of Mammon, the cause of Mammon, the causes of Mammon, the cause of Mammon, the effect of Mammon, the effects of Mammon, the effect of Mammon, the journey of Mammon, the journeys of Mammon, the journey of Mammon, the emergence of Mammon, the emergences of Mammon, the emergence of Mammon, the source of Mammon, the sources of Mammon, the source of Mammon, the originator of Mammon, the originators of Mammon, the originator of Mammon, the origin of Mammon, the origins of Mammon, the origin of Mammon, the forefather of Mammon, the forefathers of Mammon, the forefather of Mammon, the foremother of Mammon, the foremothers of Mammon, the foremother of Mammon, the ancestor of Mammon, the ancestors of Mammon, the ancestor of Mammon, the descendant of Mammon, the descendants of Mammon, the descendant of Mammon, the lineage of Mammon, the lineages of Mammon, the lineage of Mammon, the heritage of Mammon, the heritages of Mammon, the heritage of Mammon, the heir of Mammon, the heirs of Mammon, the heir of Mammon, the co-heir of Mammon, the co-heirs of Mammon, the co-heir of Mammon, the joint heir of Mammon, the joint heirs of Mammon, the joint heir of Mammon, the dynasty of Mammon, the dynasties of Mammon, the dynasty of Mammon, the force of Mammon, the forces of Mammon, the force of Mammon, the law of Mammon, the laws of Mammon, the law of Mammon, the pact of Mammon, the pacts of Mammon, the pact of Mammon, the game of Mammon, the games of Mammon, the game of Mammon, the mask of Mammon, the masks of Mammon, the mask of Mammon, the armor of Mammon, the armors of Mammon, the armor of Mammon, the sword of Mammon, the swords of Mammon, the sword of Mammon, the shield of Mammon, the shields of Mammon, the shield of Mammon, the force shield of Mammon, the force shields of Mammon, the force shield of Mammon, the armored force shield of Mammon, the armored force shields of Mammon, the armored force shield of Mammon, the champion of Mammon, the champions of Mammon, the champion of Mammon, the guardian of Mammon, the guardians of Mammon, the guardian of Mammon, the defender of Mammon, the defenders of Mammon, the defender of Mammon, the protector of Mammon, the protectors of Mammon, the protector of Mammon, the chant of Mammon, the chants of Mammon, the chant of Mammon, the shape of Mammon, the shapes of Mammon, the shape of Mammon, the cube of Mammon, the cubes of Mammon, the cube of Mammon, the cuboid of Mammon, the cuboids of Mammon, the cuboid of Mammon, the sphere of Mammon, the spheres of Mammon, the sphere of Mammon, the spheroid of Mammon, the spheroids of Mammon, the spheroid of Mammon, the prism of Mammon, the prisms of Mammon, the prism of Mammon, the pyramid of Mammon, the pyramids of Mammon, the pyramid of Mammon, the cylinder of Mammon, the cylinders of Mammon, the cylinder of Mammon, the cone of Mammon, the cones of Mammon, the cone of Mammon, the triangle of Mammon, the triangles of Mammon, the triangle of Mammon, the circle of Mammon, the circles of Mammon, the circle of Mammon, the semicircle of Mammon, the semicircles of Mammon, the semicircle of Mammon, the square of Mammon, the squares of Mammon, the square of Mammon, the rectangle of Mammon, the rectangles of Mammon, the rectangle of Mammon, the parallelogram of Mammon, the parallelograms of Mammon, the parallelogram of Mammon, the rhombus of Mammon, the rhombuses of Mammon, the rhombus of Mammon, the trapezoid of Mammon, the trapezoids of Mammon, the trapezoid of Mammon, the polygon of Mammon, the polygons of Mammon, the polygon of Mammon, the pentagon of Mammon, the pentagons of Mammon, the pentagon of Mammon, the hexagon of Mammon, the hexagons of Mammon, the hexagon of Mammon, the septagon of Mammon, the septagons of Mammon, the septagon of Mammon, the octagon of Mammon, the octagons of Mammon, the octagon of Mammon, the nonagon of Mammon, the nonagons of Mammon, the nonagon of Mammon, the decagon of Mammon, the decagons of Mammon, the decagon of Mammon, the evolution of Mammon, the evolutions of Mammon, the evolution of Mammon, the revolution of Mammon, the revolutions of Mammon, the revolution of Mammon, the elemental art of Mammon, the elemental arts of Mammon, the elemental art of Mammon, the elemental science of Mammon, the elemental sciences of Mammon, the elemental science of Mammon, the elemental principle of Mammon, the elemental principles of Mammon, the elemental principle of Mammon, the elemental technology of Mammon, the elemental technologies of Mammon, the elemental technology of Mammon, the low elemental art of Mammon, the low elemental arts of Mammon, the low elemental art of Mammon, the low elemental science of Mammon, the low elemental sciences of Mammon, the low elemental science of Mammon, the low elemental principle of Mammon, the low elemental principles of Mammon, the low elemental principle of Mammon, the low elemental technology of Mammon, the low elemental technologies of Mammon, the low elemental technology of Mammon, The high elemental art of Mammon. The high elemental arts of Mammon. The high elemental art of Mammon. The high elemental science of Mammon. The high elemental sciences of Mammon. The high elemental science of Mammon. The high elemental principle of Mammon. The high elemental principles of Mammon. The high elemental principle of Mammon. The high elemental technology of Mammon. The high elemental technologies of Mammon. The high elemental technology of Mammon. The agent of Mammon. The agents of Mammon. The agent of Mammon. The agency of Mammon. The agencies of Mammon. The agency of Mammon. The amplifier of Mammon. The amplifiers of Mammon. The amplifier of Mammon. The amplification of Mammon. The amplifications of Mammon. The amplification of Mammon. The enhancer of Mammon. The enhancers of Mammon. The enhancer of Mammon. The enhancement of Mammon. The enhancements of Mammon. The enhancement of Mammon. The magnifier of Mammon. The magnifiers of Mammon. The magnifier of Mammon. The magnification of Mammon. The magnifications of Mammon. The magnification of Mammon. The influencer of Mammon. The influencers of Mammon. The influencer of Mammon. The influence of Mammon. The influences of Mammon. The influence of Mammon. The emanator of Mammon. The emanators of Mammon. The emanator of Mammon. The emanation of Mammon. The emanations of Mammon. The emanation of Mammon. The converger of Mammon. The convergers of Mammon. The converger of Mammon. The convergence of Mammon. The convergences of Mammon. The convergence of Mammon. The aura of Mammon. The auras of Mammon. The aura of Mammon. The impression of Mammon. The impressions of Mammon. The impression of Mammon. The intelligence of Mammon. The intelligences of Mammon. The intelligence of Mammon. The sophistication of Mammon. The sophistications of Mammon. The sophistication of Mammon. The genius of Mammon. The geniuses of Mammon. The genius of Mammon. The polymath of Mammon. The polymaths of Mammon. The polymath of Mammon. The psychic of Mammon. The psychics of Mammon. The psychic of Mammon. The knowledge of Mammon. The knowledges of Mammon. The knowledge of Mammon. The understanding of Mammon. The understandings of Mammon. The understanding of Mammon. The wisdom of Mammon. The wisdoms of Mammon. The wisdom of Mammon. The secret of Mammon. The secrets of Mammon. The secret of Mammon. The mystery of Mammon. The mysteries of Mammon. The mystery of Mammon. The revelation of Mammon. The revelations of Mammon. The revelation of Mammon. The tactic of Mammon. The tactics of Mammon. The tactic of Mammon. The strategy of Mammon. The strategies of Mammon. The strategy of Mammon. The strength of Mammon. The strengths of Mammon. The strength of Mammon. The might of Mammon. The mights of Mammon. The might of Mammon. The power of Mammon. The powers of Mammon. The power of Mammon. The authority of Mammon. The authorities of Mammon. The authority of Mammon. The dominion of Mammon. The dominions of Mammon. The dominion of Mammon. The rhythm of Mammon. The rhythms of Mammon. The rhythm of Mammon. The melody of Mammon. The melodies of Mammon. The melody of Mammon. The music of Mammon. The musics of Mammon. The music of Mammon. The lyric of Mammon. The lyrics of Mammon. The lyric of Mammon. The song of Mammon. The songs of Mammon. The song of Mammon. The dance of Mammon. The dances of Mammon. The dance of Mammon. The spirit of Mammon. The spirits of Mammon. The spirit of Mammon. The soul of Mammon. The souls of Mammon. The soul of Mammon. The body of Mammon. The bodies of Mammon. The body of Mammon. The mark of Mammon. The marks of Mammon. The mark of Mammon. The promise of Mammon. The promises of Mammon. The promise of Mammon. The visionary of Mammon. The visionaries of Mammon. The visionary of Mammon. The vision of Mammon. The visions of Mammon. The vision of Mammon. The picture of Mammon. The pictures of Mammon. The picture of Mammon. The sound of Mammon. The sounds of Mammon. The sound of Mammon. The dung of Mammon. The dungs of Mammon. The dung of Mammon. The language of Mammon. The languages of Mammon. The language of Mammon. The communication of Mammon. The communications of Mammon. The communication of Mammon. The people of Mammon. The peoples of Mammon. The people of Mammon. The society of Mammon. The societies of Mammon. The society of Mammon. the fortress of Mammon, the fortresses of Mammon, the fortress of Mammon, the government of Mammon, the governments of Mammon, the government of Mammon, the city of Mammon, the cities of Mammon, the city of Mammon, the nation of Mammon, the nations of Mammon, the nation of Mammon, the civilization of Mammon, the civilizations of Mammon, the civilization of Mammon, the world of Mammon, the worlds of Mammon, the world of Mammon,